You didn't enter the wrong room. You entered mine, and you're not leaving. Damien Moretti said that the moment he crushed my wrist, me, a waitress who only meant to deliver pastries and accidentally opened the wrong door. Inside was a Mafia meeting. His men stared at me like I was a rat that wandered straight into a slaughterhouse. But what suffocated me wasn't the guns. It was his eyes. Eyes that looked like they had recognized me long before this moment. "My cameras have seen you too many times," he whispered. "I want to know why." His men were confused. Damien wasn't. He only pulled me closer and repeated, slow and certain, "She stays." And in that moment I understood. My biggest mistake was opening a door that belonged to him, and he had decided to lock me inside. That was the exact moment, right there on the dark, polished marble floor of the Moretti establishment, when my life stopped being my own. I was just supposed to be doing my usual double shift, trying to pocket enough cash to finally replace the busted muffler on my old pickup. And then suddenly I was standing still in a room that smelled like expensive scotch, old money, and impending violence, holding a tray that felt impossibly heavy. I remember the gold handle of the door, heavy and cool in my palm, and the rush of warm air conditioning hitting my face when I pushed it open, thinking I was heading into the private dining room for Mr. Henderson's retirement party. Instead, I walked into a hush so immediate and complete it felt like someone had flipped a massive switch, cutting the sound right out of the air. The room was huge and dark, framed by tall windows draped in velvet, but the only light came from a single, low-hanging crystal fixture that caught the metallic gleam of the weapons resting casually on the mahogany table. It wasn't a meeting about quarterly reports. It was a cluster of hard faces gathered around a sheet of paper that had a diagram on it, and the last word I distinctly heard before I was spotted was, "dispose," followed by a chilling laugh. That's when I saw him, Damien Moretti, seated at the head, not even moving, just watching me with an unnerving stillness that made the hairs on my arms stand up like static electricity. I noticed the way the expensive crystal glass in his hand caught the light, and how his suit was so perfectly cut, it looked like it was molded to his powerful frame. A man who never needed to raise his voice to command absolute obedience. Everything about the scene screamed that I had not just committed a mistake, but a transgression, a violation of a sacred, dangerous privacy that was punishable by instant annihilation. And the casual menace radiating from every man in that room was a suffocating physical weight. The silence broke like shattered glass when one massive man, built like a fire hydrant and wearing a perfectly tailored suit that looked like it cost more than my entire apartment, roared, "Who the hell let the waitress in?" The sound was so loud, so unexpected, that I actually flinched, my shoulders jumping right up to my ears. My hands were shaking so hard that the heavy silver tray, laden with delicate, cream-filled eclairs and petit fours, finally slipped right out of my grasp. It didn't just fall. It spun in slow motion, clattering against the marble before the pastries hit the floor with soft, wet thuds. The sound was pathetic, completely out of place in that room of cold, dangerous men, and the sight of the ruined, scattered desserts, the white cream oozing onto the dark, unforgiving marble, just added to the absurdity of the situation, making me feel even smaller and more incompetent than I already did. Some of the men started to laugh, a loud, barking kind of sound that was devoid of any humor, simply mockery, and one of them drawled, leaning back in his chair, running a finger along the rim of his glass. "Look at her shaking. Pathetic. She looks like she's about to cry, boys. Maybe she's seen a ghost, or maybe she realized she just walked into her own funeral. Someone ought to clean up that mess before she smears it everywhere." The scorn in their voices was palpable. Not just contempt for my fear, but contempt for my entire existence. For the very idea that someone like me should dare to breathe the air in their rarefied, deadly world. I could feel the heat creeping up my neck and cheeks, the immediate rush of shame mixing with the primal, terrifying fear that made my breath shallow and ragged in my chest. And I couldn't move. Couldn't speak. Frozen like a frightened deer caught in the headlights, utterly incapable of forming a coherent thought, let alone an excuse that would save my life. Before I go further, if you're watching this and you've ever felt that pit in your stomach fear of being completely invisible 1 minute and then suddenly being the most vulnerable person in the room the next, then you know this feeling. It's isolating, and it makes you feel like you have to shrink down to nothing just to survive the moment, praying for the ground to swallow you whole. It's the feeling of being judged and dismissed before you've even opened your mouth, simply because of your circumstance. If this story resonates with you at all, take just a quick second, open up your phone if you're not already holding it, and please hit that like button. It really helps me know this is worth sharing. Drop a comment below if you've ever felt underestimated, if you've ever had to hold on to your dignity when everyone else was telling you you had none, and consider subscribing to the channel. I'm sharing this journey so we can walk through the heartbreak and eventually the healing together. Thank you. Now, back to the room. Damien Moretti finally moved, only slightly, leaning his chin onto his laced fingers, and his voice was low, heavy, and colder than anything I'd ever heard, cutting through the laughter like a razor blade slicing through cheap silk. "You're not leaving," he stated, and the simple finality of those 3 words stopped my heart completely, the sound echoing in the sudden, sharp silence they created. I felt 2 rough hands grab my arms, twisting them behind my back before I could even formulate a plea or a pathetic defense. And I was being dragged, stumbling over the remains of the pastries and the slick silver tray, toward a solid wooden chair in the corner of the room, far away from the main table, as if I were too contaminated to remain near their precious business. They didn't tie my hands or feet with cheap rope, not yet, but they used thick, expensive-looking silk scarves, a macabre little detail that screamed of wealth and cruelty, turning my detainment into a sickening sort of luxury. And the man who was securing the knot around my wrist called me the Rat, with a sneer that showed his chipped front tooth, adding a humiliating layer of insect-like insignificance to my terror. I tried to beg, stammering out that I was lost, that I was just Lana, the girl who cleans the banquet halls and serves the desserts, a nobody. But the men just roared with amusement again, the sound bouncing off the high ceiling and intensifying my panic, and the fire hydrant man laughed. "Sure, and I'm the Pope. Every spy says they're lost, sweetheart. Just tell the truth so we can finish the processing and figure out who sent you." Then, another man, thin and calculating, wearing thick-rimmed glasses that gave him a disturbingly academic air, pulled out a small, leather-bound notebook and a gleaming silver pen, asking me questions about my name, my address, and my phone number, detailing my information as though he was meticulously filling out a standardized form. The clinical, bureaucratic nature of recording my data felt so much more terrifying than a direct threat. It was the chilling, detached efficiency of men accustomed to erasing people, like they were preparing to process a corpse or an inventory item that needed cataloging before disposal, and the utter lack of emotion in the man's gaze was soul-crushing. I was already counting down the seconds until my brief, unremarkable life came to an end. I was preparing for the inevitable, thinking about how my old truck would be towed and what would happen to my meager bank account, dwelling on the small, sad finality of my non-existence, when Damien stood up, and the entire atmosphere of the room shifted again, crackling with a new, unpredictable energy that was somehow even more frightening than the initial burst of aggression. He moved slowly, deliberately, gliding around the table until he was standing right in front of me, his height and sheer presence dominating my field of vision, forcing me to tilt my head back at an uncomfortable angle to look at his face, which was devoid of any emotion. A perfect granite mask that betrayed nothing of his inner thoughts. He reached out with one finger, his touch surprisingly cool and light against the heat of my skin, tipping my chin up. But the subtle pressure was enough to make my entire body tense up, ready to flinch away from the expected blow, bracing for the punishment I knew I deserved for intruding. The room was silent once more, all his men holding their breath, waiting for the execution order that seemed imminent. But instead of calling for blood, he just stared, his eyes boring into mine with an unnerving intensity that felt like he was peering directly into my soul, searching for the hidden answers that only I possessed. Then, a slow, almost imperceptible smile curled the corner of his lip, though it didn't reach his eyes, and a terrifying sense of recognition dawned on me, confirming the chilling feeling from earlier. "You again," he murmured, his voice a low vibration that only I could hear over the rushing panic in my ears, and the sound of that word, again, sent a fresh jolt of fear mixed with confusion shooting straight through me, making me instinctively try to pull my face away, to escape the depth of his knowledge. But his grip tightened fractionally, holding me fast, keeping me locked in his disturbing gaze. My voice came out as a weak, reedy squeak, barely audible above the ringing in my ears. "Again? I don't know what you mean," I pleaded, desperately trying to rack my brain to remember if I had ever spilled coffee on him or messed up an order during one of the catering gigs. But his face wasn't familiar to me. Not in a personal way. Only in the way a dark, powerful storm cloud is familiar when you see it approaching menacingly over the horizon. He let go of my chin, pulling his hand away and letting it rest lightly on the back of my chair. And then he let out a short, hollow laugh that didn't sound happy or amused, but rather like a deep, frustrating mystery had just been solved, like the final, elusive piece of a complicated puzzle had clicked perfectly into place. He addressed the room, not me, his voice regaining its command and drawing the attention of every single man present. And the shift in his focus offered me a brief, blessed moment of reprieve. "She is not a rat," he stated, the words heavy and absolute, dismissing their assumptions with complete authority. "But she is an unexplained variable. I have seen her many times on the surveillance footage near the loading docks, close to our transaction sites, always just a quiet shadow in the background, always watching but never getting close enough to be a real threat. Too consistent to be random, too detached to be a spy." He paused, letting that sink in, and I could feel the confusion and skepticism rolling off his men in palpable waves, their eyes darting from him to me, trying to reconcile the terrifying words with the small, trembling waitress in the silk restraints. The truth was, his description of me as an unexplained variable was terrifyingly accurate. I had always been drawn to the dark, fascinating choreography of their world, observing it from a distance, feeling like an invisible witness to something monumental. It was true, though. I had been there, lurking on the edges of his territory. I often worked the catering jobs that serviced his buildings late at night, and sometimes, taking my designated smoke break or waiting for my late ride, I would see the stream of identical black cars and the serious men moving with choreographed intent in the dark. And I had watched, not because I was a spy, but because the contrast between their world of absolute, unquestioned power and my own desperate struggle for existence was so stark and fascinating, so alien, it was impossible to ignore. I was a ghost in the background of their massive, dangerous transactions. Damien confirmed my own unsettling observation, stating that he had given a specific, standing order to his security detail a few weeks prior. "If she appears inside the perimeter again, bring her to me immediately, unharmed, no matter the circumstances." He then gave a sharp nod to the man who had restrained me, a gesture so subtle that it could have been missed. But the message was clear and instantly obeyed, and the thick silk scarves were instantly cut with a discreet utility knife, the ends falling away from my wrists and pooling on the floor, leaving angry, red, raw marks where they had been digging into my skin. "Release her," he ordered, but before the man could fully step away, Damien took my wrist, not crushing it this time, but holding it firmly, possessively, his fingers warm and dry against my suddenly cold, damp skin, making it clear that the physical claim had merely shifted hands. "She walks with me," Damien announced, pulling me forcibly to my feet, the sheer force of his presence and his reputation dictating my movement. "No one touches her, no one questions her, and no one speaks her name again until I give permission. She is my responsibility now." The men looked genuinely shocked, exchanging bewildered glances and confused, frustrated shrugs, clearly unable to process the sudden, illogical shift from certain execution to personal protection. And one of them, the thin man who had been writing down my details, had the nerve to open his mouth to weakly protest. But a single, focused warning look from Damien, a look that promised a slow, agonizing death if he dared to utter a sound, was enough to snap his jaw shut and send him retreating. I was utterly stunned, my mind struggling to process the impossible truth. I wasn't just being saved, I was being claimed like a prized artifact or a key piece of information. I realized I hadn't just stumbled into a room, but into the very center of his world. A world where every single move was calculated, and nothing, especially me, was accidental. Damien bent his head down, his lips brushing my ear so lightly that it felt like a whisper of wind. His scent a mix of fine leather and danger. But his words hit me with the force of a physical blow. "You didn't enter the wrong room, Lana," he repeated, only this time the edge in his voice was softer, laced with a strange, dark fascination and a hint of satisfaction. "You entered the room I've been waiting in for you to finally walk into, the room where I knew you belonged." The shift was immediate, but it wasn't safety. It was just a different, more complicated and far more public kind of danger. I went from being the waitress who was about to be erased to the waitress who was suddenly attached to the most powerful, enigmatic, and perhaps most feared man in the room. And I quickly learned that neither position granted me any real dignity or peace of mind. The men, who minutes earlier had been preparing to dispose of my body and call me rat, now followed Damien's command out of fear. But they didn't treat me with respect. They treated me like an object he had picked up, something low status and disposable that had momentarily caught his eye, an ill-fitting accessory. They started calling me the boss's new toy, or worse, Moretti's charity case, whispering the words with sneering, superior smiles whenever they thought Damien was out of earshot, or even when he was close enough to hear, daring him to react, and thereby confirm his affection. The way they looked at me, a cold, dismissive appraisal that traveled from my worn shoes to my plain face, lingering with condescension, made it clear they thought I was nothing more than a temporary indulgence, a cheap trinket he'd soon discard when the novelty wore off, entirely unworthy of the expensive air I was breathing. The first few hours felt like walking a tightrope over a bottomless pit of judgment. I was told to stay near Damien, but the sheer awkwardness and tension made my skin crawl, and I kept trying to find a way out, sliding toward the nearest exit whenever his attention was momentarily diverted, desperate for the anonymity of the street outside, where my only problem was a broken-down truck. I wasn't brave. I was just terrified and longed for my old, unremarkable life back, even the one with the broken muffler and the grueling double shifts that left me exhausted but free. Each time I tried to slip away, Damien would catch me without even turning his head, his hand shooting out and grabbing the back of my elbow with the speed of a striking viper, the grip firm and authoritative, but never painful enough to leave a bruise, just enough to stop me cold in my tracks and remind me who was in control. "Where are you going, Lana?" he'd ask, his voice perfectly level, a dangerous quiet in his tone that belied the tension in his eyes. When I mumbled some excuse about needing to use the restroom or fetch something mundane, he'd lean in, his expensive cologne enveloping me, and his reply was chillingly possessive, a subtle menace underlying the soft words. "Pets don't run, Lana. You stay close. I don't chase what's mine, I keep it tethered." The word pet stung more than any direct insult, confirming everything the other men thought about my submissive role, and it made me feel like all my quiet resilience and moral strength, everything I valued about myself, was being reduced to a simple, subservient role in his dangerous, gilded cage. The humiliation peaked when a formal meeting of the local syndicate was called, a massive gathering that brought in men and women from every single crew in the city, all of them dressed in immaculate designer clothes, glittering with jewelry, and possessing an air of entitled power that made my simple, black polyester uniform feel like a neon sign, broadcasting my poverty and lack of importance. When Damien ordered me to serve the drinks, it was a deliberate, calculated act of public shaming, a clear, unmistakable message to everyone in the room. She is only a servant, regardless of who she stands next to, and her place is below yours. He made me stand slightly behind his chair, like an assistant, initially, but then commanded me to move among the guests, offering crystal glasses of vintage scotch and champagne, forcing me to return to the lowest job I was trying to escape. Only this time I was doing it under the most intense, critical, and mocking scrutiny imaginable. As I passed by a cluster of powerful women, one of them, a silver-haired matriarch named Lucia, who looked like she ran the entire city's legitimate art funding operations and possessed an intimidating aura of old-world authority, leaned over her glass, her eyes cold and sharp as she assessed me, then turned to her companion and sneered, "Look at the little serving girl. She serves drinks now, does she? Well, that's fine. Later, she'll just serve him in a different capacity, won't she?" Her companion snickered, hiding her smile behind a silk fan, their words cutting into me like shards of ice and adding a layer of sexual objectification to the social humiliation, and the clear implication that I was nothing but a cheap piece of property to be used sexually and then discarded, made me clutch the heavy silver tray so tightly my knuckles turned white, threatening to crack the delicate glass. I didn't drop it. I just kept my eyes fixed on the tray, took one deep, steadying breath that smelled faintly of the fear in the room, and moved on, the rhythm of my steps silent and steady, determined not to let them see the raw, burning sting of their cruelty. The most difficult thing was being forced to stand behind Damien like an unwilling, silent assistant, listening to their brutal discussions about territory, money, and power. The casual way they talked about violence making my blood run cold, all while realizing I was trapped in a vortex I couldn't possibly understand and certainly couldn't escape without a miracle. My back ached from standing ramrod straight for hours, my feet hurt from the cheap shoes, and the sheer tension of trying to appear invisible, while simultaneously being the most intensely watched person in the room, was physically and emotionally exhausting. I was acutely aware of the irony. I was standing inches away from one of the most powerful men in the world, surrounded by millions of dollars of wealth and influence, yet I felt lower, less powerful, than I ever had on the street corner waiting for the bus, because there, at least, I was free to walk away. To the Mafia, I was unworthy of even standing near a Moretti, my humble origins acting like a literal stain on his reputation, a piece of cheap luggage he had inexplicably brought into a five-star hotel they now had to tolerate. They saw my worn uniform, they saw my quiet demeanor, and they saw a lifetime of scraping by, and they translated all of it into one simple, devastating word: trash. But as the hours dragged on, and I listened to their predictable, repetitive arguments about percentages and boundaries, about loyalty and betrayal, a strange stillness began to settle over me, a quiet observation taking root, and I started noticing the cracks in their polished facade, the greed, the insecurity, and the small, telltale gestures that gave away their true intent, like a tremor in a hand when a name was mentioned, or a flicker of pure, naked fear in the eyes when Damien spoke. Details the powerful men missed, but the invisible waitress caught. My unexpected liberation from the pet status came when I finally understood that listening was not just a passive defense mechanism against the constant insults, but an active, necessary tool for survival in this dangerous labyrinth. It was late, and the large meeting had finally dissolved into a much smaller, hazier gathering of trusted associates, a scene thick with cigar smoke and heavy drinking, with Damien sitting quietly at the head of the table, while most of the others were engaged in loud, careless conversations that were sloppy with fatigue and alcohol. I was standing near the back wall, waiting for my inevitable dismissal, desperate to be allowed to clean up the spilled drinks and then disappear into the night, when I overheard two men near a sidebar, their voices thick with alcohol and conspiracy, barely above a whisper but audible in the relative quiet. One of them, a man named Pavel, who had been very loud and aggressively dismissive of me all evening, was slurring something about a change in leadership and how Moretti won't see the sunrise, not after tonight. He then pulled out his phone and showed the other man a photo of a rifle scope zeroed in on the exact window directly behind where Damien was sitting, a horrifying piece of proof that shattered the drunken facade. My blood ran cold, instantly sobering me, and I realized with sickening clarity that this wasn't just drunken talk or idle threats. This was a real, immediate and poorly concealed plan to assassinate Damien within minutes, using the chaos of the late-night gathering as cover. My heart hammered against my ribs, not out of any loyalty to him, not yet, but because the violence of it was so raw, so imminent, and the thought of an explosion of gunfire ripping through the room, making me an unwilling, accidental casualty, was a paralyzing horror I couldn't accept. I didn't think. I acted on pure, gut-wrenching panic and a desperate need to stop the inevitable from happening right in front of me. A surge of adrenaline overriding the years of training myself to be quiet and invisible. I pushed off the wall and ran, not elegantly, but with a clumsy, reckless speed that sent a few empty glasses tumbling off a nearby table. The resulting explosion of noise drawing every eye in the room toward me, exactly what I was trying to avoid. I burst into the small circle where Damien was talking to a trusted lieutenant, my breath ragged and coming in shallow gasps, shouting over the sudden silence that was thick with alarm. "He's going to kill you. Pavel, right now, through the window. Look at his phone." I pointed a trembling finger at Pavel, who instantly froze, his face going pale with shock and fear. The wide-eyed look on his face confirming my accusation more effectively than any surveillance footage or confession could have. The entire room went silent, all eyes shifting from me, the pathetic, screaming waitress, to Pavel, the obvious traitor, and then to Damien, whose expression remained completely unreadable, a study in granite control, not even a flicker of surprise or fear registering in his dark, intense eyes. Damien didn't panic, didn't look outside at the window, and he didn't even bother to look at Pavel, the threat. He looked only at me, his focus absolute. He reached beneath the table and pulled out a heavy, matte black handgun, which he slammed onto the polished mahogany surface between us, with a terrifying, solid thud that echoed in the sudden, absolute silence, making me jump. "If you're not a spy, Lana," he challenged, his voice dangerously low, stripped bare of any emotion. "And if you know who the traitor is, then pick up the gun, pull the trigger on the threat." My hand started shaking violently just at the sight of the weapon, a raw, uncontrollable tremor running through my entire body because I'd never touched a gun in my life, let alone held one pointed at another human being, and the sheer moral weight of the act was crushing. It felt heavy and cold, alien in my small hand, a terrifying tool of finality. But the sight of Pavel slowly, ominously reaching into his suit jacket for his own weapon forced my decision, and in a movement driven by pure, protective adrenaline and the instinct to survive, I grabbed the gun, lifted it, and pointed the barrel directly at Pavel's chest. The man who had mocked me and called me pathetic immediately confessed, his eyes wide with fear, screaming, "No, it wasn't me! Victor put me up to it, I swear!" His desperate, high-pitched plea shattered the tension, instantly diverting the focus from me, the trembling waitress holding the gun, to the real core of the betrayal. Victor Sokolov, a name everyone in the room recognized as a rival boss whose ambitions had become too large. Damien stood up then, slow and measured, and the sheer power of his movement was enough to make everyone flinch and avert their eyes. He walked over to Pavel, not bothering to draw his own weapon, and simply delivered a brutal, precise blow to the man's jaw that sent him crumpling instantly to the floor, his head hitting the marble with a sickening crack. The weapon I was holding felt impossibly heavy now that the immediate threat was gone, the adrenaline draining out of me, and I let it clatter onto the table, stepping back, my chest heaving as I tried to regain control of my breath, my mind reeling from the impossible fact that I had just saved the life of a powerful Mafia boss. Damien looked at me then, truly looked at me, and his gaze was entirely different from the predatory, assessing look he'd worn before. It was appraising, almost respectful, tinged with a dangerous curiosity, as if he was seeing me clearly for the very first time, not as a variable but as a force. "Not a pet," he finally said, letting the words hang in the smoke-filled air for a long, pregnant moment, acknowledging the shock and awe of the room and silencing the last of the murmurs. He didn't offer praise or a compliment, nothing warm or kind, but his next words were 1,000 times more valuable than a thank you. "You're useful," he stated. And just like that, with one small, brutal action, I had destroyed their collective assumptions about my worth, cementing my place as someone to be feared, not mocked. The quiet respect I'd earned with the gun was immediately shattered when Viktor Sokolov, the man behind the failed assassination, shifted his tactics from direct violence to a calculated, insidious psychological war against Damien, using me as the weapon. Since he couldn't kill Damien outright without starting a global conflict, he decided to undermine him by destroying his confidence and his trust in the one person he'd unexpectedly protected. Victor's move was swift, insidious, and perfectly targeted to strike at the deepest insecurities that plague the Mafia world: honor, loyalty, and the debilitating fear of being made a fool of in public. Within 48 hours, rumors began circulating like wildfire among the crews that Lana wasn't a humble waitress, but a known grifter, a low-class thief who had been fired from 3 separate service jobs for stealing petty cash from the till, or skimming credit card numbers from expensive parties. These were all complete fabrications, disgusting, untrue lies concocted to discredit me and strip away my dignity. But in that closed, hyper-suspicious world, a whisper repeated enough times by enough important people becomes an undeniable fact, and my honest, resilient character was suddenly smeared with the label of a cheap, common criminal who couldn't be trusted with a paper napkin. The real blow, though, the one that reached straight into my past and tore out something clean, came when Victor managed to bribe Ethan, my ex-boyfriend, a weak, self-serving man who had always been jealous of my ambition and quiet dignity, the kind of person who sells a secret for a few $100s. Victor paid Ethan to enter one of Damien's private clubs, a place I never would have allowed him near, and make a very public spectacle of my supposed failings. Ethan, reeking of cheap cologne and false confidence, the smell of which instantly brought back memories of our unhappy life together, walked straight up to the bar where I was setting up a small display of gourmet hors d'oeuvres, and, in a voice loud enough to carry across the entire, suddenly silent room, shouted, "There she is! Still serving tables, Lana? You begged me for money just last month to pay your electric bill, you remember that? You're trash, Damien! Your boss picked up leftover garbage that belongs on the street, and everyone knows it." The room, full of mid-level enforcers and local financiers who were trying to figure out where I stood in the hierarchy, erupted in cruel, knowing laughter, the sound utterly devastating. They saw Ethan, a mediocre man with a slight tan and a loud mouth, claiming ownership of my past and my neediness, and it instantly stripped away any perceived dignity I had gained by saving Damien's life. The men started repeating the phrase, their voices full of disdain and a terrible finality. "Boss Moretti picked up leftover garbage? What a disgrace. He must be losing his mind over a cheap gold digger. Look how easy she is to control." The humiliation was overwhelming. A raw, burning feeling in my throat that I desperately swallowed down, fighting to keep my face expressionless, refusing to let them see me cry or break. But the cruel words echoed in my head, poisoning the quiet strength I had worked so hard to build. Just when I thought the psychological attack couldn't get any worse, just as I was forcing myself to pick up a dropped napkin with steady hands, Victor sent an old, private photograph to Damien's secure burner phone, projecting it onto a large screen during a supposedly confidential video conference with his trusted captains in another city. The photo was of me, maybe 3 years ago, hugging Ethan tightly in a casual, intimate moment after a long night of work. A picture that meant nothing but friendship and shared exhaustion back then, and the accompanying message flashed across the bottom of the screen in stark white letters for all to see. "Your waitress belongs to someone else. She has a leash and a master, Moretti. Go play with your own toys." The men in the conference room didn't even try to hide their gasps and murmurs. The implication was clear. I was still tied to my past, still being manipulated by another man, and therefore I was untrustworthy, a risk, and a monumental embarrassment to Damien, who prided himself on absolute control. I watched Damien's face as he saw the picture, and that was the moment that hurt more than any insult or lie. He didn't rage, didn't curse, and didn't even look at me with accusation or demand an explanation. He simply went completely still, his eyes narrowing slightly, becoming infinitely distant and cold, And then, without saying a single word to me or his men, he stood up slowly, adjusted the cuffs of his expensive suit, and walked silently out of the room, leaving me alone with the gigantic, humiliating image of my past self, smiling innocently, and the collective damning judgment of all his men. That silence, that cool, absolute, and unforgiving withdrawal, his decision to not engage, to simply disappear, was worse than a slap, worse than the original death threat. It confirmed that the one thing I couldn't bear to lose, the tentative, unspoken trust he had started to place in me, the respect I had earned with the gun, had been completely shattered. It made me feel utterly betrayed by my own history, by a weak man who had meant nothing. And most importantly, it showed me that Damien's real weakness wasn't violence or political maneuvering, but his devastating vulnerability to being played the fool by an opportunistic rival. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, the silence punctuated only by the low, humiliating humming sound of the projector fan, until a kind of cold, quiet determination settled over me. I had to prove the lies wrong, not for them, and not even just for him, but for myself, and for the possibility of a clean slate that was quickly slipping away into the darkness of his distrust. Victor's strategy of exploiting Damien's trust backfired dramatically, not because I was persuasive or because I begged for his forgiveness, but because Damien Moretti was not a man who tolerated loose ends or public embarrassment in his own affairs. When he walked out of that room, he didn't disappear to sulk or mourn his pride. He went to investigate, to tear apart the fabricated story piece by piece, because an accusation against someone he had publicly acknowledged and tentatively vouched for, even one as seemingly insignificant as me, was an immediate, strategic attack on his own judgment and authority. It took him less than 24 hours, relying on his massive network of informants and digital assets, to uncover the complex, ugly truth. Ethan wasn't just my ex. He was a low-level informant, receiving regular payments from Viktor Sokolov's accountant, and the public humiliation was a deliberate, coordinated effort to distract Damien from a critical financial transfer they were trying to intercept from his European accounts. This revelation, that the attack against me was merely a strategic smokescreen for a much greater betrayal of the organization, seemed to solidify my place in his mind, shifting me from a potential liability to a key piece of evidence in an ongoing, brutal war. The healing twist came, not in a grand ballroom or an opulent office, but in a dusty, dimly lit warehouse by the docks, a place I instinctively knew spelled trouble the second I was lured there with a fake text message. I received a text message, supposedly from Ethan, asking me to meet him there to talk about old times and clear up the misunderstanding. A cheap, desperate attempt by Victor to isolate me and leverage me against Damien in a vulnerable setting. I knew the text was a lie, a terrible trap, but something deep inside, maybe a misplaced sense of closure, or maybe a dangerous need to face the ghost of my past and finally close that humiliating chapter, compelled me to go, my quiet dignity demanding a confrontation with the source of the recent pain. I walked into the cavernous space, the air thick with the smell of brine, old machinery, and neglect, and found Ethan waiting for me, looking impossibly nervous and sweaty. But Victor was there too, leaning against a stack of wooden crates, his face a mask of smug, triumphant satisfaction. Before I could even open my mouth to ask why he had sunk so low, the heavy metal door behind me slammed shut with a horrifying, final clang that echoed loudly, trapping me inside, and Victor's cold eyes glittered as he drawled, "Waiting for your boss, Lana? You know, the one you betrayed, the one who left you for scrap?" Before I could reply with the angry denial that was bubbling up inside me, the warehouse door was kicked inward with a sound that reverberated like a cannon blast, tearing free from its hinges and sending a rush of cold air and dust into the space. And Damien Moretti stormed in, a figure of absolute, uncontained fury, alone and moving with the silent, deadly focus of a predator hunting its trapped prey. He didn't look at me or Victor. His focus was entirely on Ethan, the weak link, the man who had dared to touch his affairs and undermine his reputation. He grabbed Ethan by the throat with one hand, lifting him clean off the concrete floor, his feet scrambling uselessly in the air, a sight that was simultaneously terrifying and righteous. And his voice was a low, terrifying growl that resonated with the sound of pure, righteous violence and betrayal. "She never betrayed me," Damien stated, his grip tightening as Ethan choked out a desperate, gurgling sound, his eyes wide with paralyzing fear. "You did, you pathetic insect who sells his soul for pocket change." I watched, horrified, as Ethan's face turned purple, his eyes bulging, and for a terrifying moment, I truly believed Damien would snap his neck right there, right in front of me, and in that moment of raw, primal fear and witnessing the overwhelming power he wielded, a strange, unexpected flood of compassion for the utterly despicable, weak Ethan surged through me, born not of affection, but of a deep moral opposition to unnecessary cruelty. "Stop it! Please, Damien, don't kill him! It's not worth it!" I cried out, rushing forward and putting a trembling hand on Damien's arm, a gesture that was shockingly bold and completely out of character for me. But I couldn't stand the thought of being the catalyst for such a brutal, ugly murder. He paused, his focus breaking away from Ethan's struggling form, and he looked at my hand on his arm, then at my face, and the surprise in his eyes was palpable. Not because I was pleading for the traitor, but because I had dared to tell him not to do something. An act of unexpected, defiant agency that he hadn't anticipated. He slowly released Ethan, who dropped to the floor, coughing and scrambling away like a wounded animal seeking refuge in the dark corners, and Damien turned to face Victor, who was watching the scene unfold with a mixture of confusion and seething contempt. Without saying another word, Damien pulled out his phone and made a single, cold call, speaking directly into the receiver loud enough for everyone to hear, his voice broadcasting the finality of his decision. "Gather the captains. Emergency council meeting. I have a message for everyone," he ordered, his eyes never leaving Victor's face. And then he grabbed my hand, pulling me close to his side, securing me like a precious cargo. "This woman," he announced to the empty warehouse, his eyes locked on Victor, "is under my explicit protection, sealed by my investigation. Touch her again, or speak ill of her name, or even breathe her name with disrespect, and I will cut your tongue out and feed it to my dogs." He led me out of that warehouse, leaving Ethan sobbing in the corner, and Victor standing rigid with fury and the dawning realization of his failure. And as we drove away in a silent black car, my hand still held tightly in his, I finally understood. Damien not only trusted me implicitly now, having seen my truth under pressure, but he was starting to protect me with a ferocity that bordered on possession, and in his dangerous world, that was the highest, most dangerous form of respect he could ever offer. The trouble with being publicly protected by a man like Damien Moretti is that it doesn't make you safe. It just makes you a bigger, shinier, more appealing target. And worse, it makes you his Achilles' heel, his known vulnerability. The rumors didn't stop circulating in the dark corners of their world. They just morphed into something darker, more damaging to his carefully crafted reputation. The whispers now centered around one devastating, repeated phrase: Moretti lost his edge because of a waitress. To the Mafia, a leader must be ruthless, calculating, and above all, emotionally untouchable. And my continued presence next to him was seen not as a source of strength or loyalty, but as a dangerous distraction, a flaw in his system that could be ruthlessly exploited. The fear was that he was becoming soft, allowing his judgment to be clouded by sentiment, a fatal error in their line of work. Every time he showed a flicker of consideration for me, every moment he paused a conversation to ensure I was out of earshot, or offered me a rare, fleeting look of concern, it only fueled the narrative that I was his downfall, the woman who had blunted his finely tuned blade. The humiliation came from the sheer disrespect his rivals now showed him, believing he was too distracted by me to retaliate effectively or uphold his own reputation during a major meeting with a rival family over a disputed cargo shipment that represented millions in revenue. A rival named Sal, a man known for his brutal efficiency, but also for his arrogance, felt emboldened by the rumors. He leaned across the vast mahogany table and yelled directly at Damien, ignoring his lieutenants. "Settle down, Moretti. We all know you're distracted by the furniture. Your waitress made you soft. You've got blood in your eye for a cleaning girl, but no edge for business. Maybe you should go play fetch with her and let us handle the real business like men." The entire room held its breath, expecting an immediate, brutal execution or a storm of violence. But Damien, for my sake, held back, merely giving Sal a look that promised a slow, agonizing demise at a later date. But that moment of calculated restraint was seen by everyone as weakness, a sign of his compromised mental state. Then, the inevitable happened. Someone, a random, unidentified gun for hire planted in the room for just this purpose, attempted to shoot me right there in the middle of the meeting. A clear, open challenge designed not to kill me, but to prove that Damien couldn't protect me, that his protective instincts were a liability that could be exploited without consequence. I felt the sudden, shocking pressure of the air being displaced just milliseconds before the deafening crack of the gunshot, the noise echoing through the room like a thunderclap. I didn't see the shooter, but I felt Damien's hand grab my shoulder and shove me violently to the floor, instantly placing his own massive, unyielding body between mine and the direction of the muzzle flash. I heard a loud grunt of pain, a sound that wasn't loud, but was devastatingly clear and agonizing, and then the sickening thud of his heavy body hitting the ground right next to me. The room immediately erupted into chaos, a whirlwind of shouts, overturned chairs, and the rapid, sharp sounds of return fire from his guards. But all I could focus on was the spreading dark stain, blooming slowly on the expensive silk fabric of Damien's shoulder, turning the pristine white into a shocking crimson. He was injured, shot, because of me, because I was the target meant to prove his vulnerability, and the sight of his pain, the warm metallic smell of his blood, sent a wave of visceral horror and crushing self-reproach through me. He had used his own body as a shield, sacrificing his safety and his cold, powerful image to protect me, confirming that his feelings ran deeper and more dangerously than I had ever imagined. As the bodyguards swarmed the room, securing the perimeter and dragging the injured Damien out through a service door, I heard him roaring at his men, his voice thick with pain and absolute terrifying fury, even as he was being half carried out, refusing to collapse. "If anyone speaks her name again outside of this room, if anyone ever suggests she is a weakness, you will kill them. Kill them, do you understand? Do it without hesitation, without asking me." The order wasn't a show for the rivals. It was a desperate, desperate attempt to protect me by making me a forbidden topic, cloaking me in a shroud of lethal silence that no one would dare pierce. As I sat in the frantic waiting room of the private medical clinic, watching the worried, terrified faces of his most trusted men who knew the seriousness of his command, I had to confront the terrifying reality of what our connection was truly becoming. This wasn't a simple romance, and it certainly wasn't safe or healthy. The question I kept turning over and over in my mind, the one that made my hands shake as I tried to clean the faint, dried blood from my own jacket, was sharp and simple, cutting through the anxiety. Is this love? Or is this obsession? Was he protecting me because he genuinely cared about me, the Lana who was quietly resilient? Or because I had become an extension of his own power, a prized possession he couldn't bear to see anyone else damage? Damien's injury and his violent public response created a dangerous vacuum of speculation and opportunity in the Mafia world, and Viktor Sokolov, ever the cunning manipulator, saw it as the perfect moment to strike a crippling blow. The prevailing opinion was that Damien was compromised, weak, and distracted by this sentimental attachment, and his rival bosses started moving in like vultures, eager to carve up his territory while he was recovering. This pressure forced Damien to do something drastic, something entirely unprecedented and shocking in the cold, transactional history of the Italian-American Mafia Council, an act that threw tradition completely out the window. It was an act that was less about expressing affection and more about executing a perfect power move, a brutal public declaration designed to instantly elevate my status from waitress to untouchable by making me an integral, non-negotiable, and protected part of his political landscape. He summoned the entire council, hundreds of the most dangerous, suspicious, and influential men and women in the country, the true power brokers, to an emergency assembly held in a heavily guarded, undisclosed location deep within the city. I was there, walking beside him, dressed simply but impeccably in a black dress he'd insisted on, still looking like the humble outsider, but now walking with a new, quiet determination next to him, his hand firm on the small of my back as we entered the massive, opulent, but extremely tense hall. The room was thick with silent judgment and veiled hostility, and all eyes were instantly on me, expecting me to stumble, or retreat, or show any sign of the cheapness they had already ascribed to me. But I met their gazes steadily. Damien, who still had a visible sling under his suit jacket, reminding everyone of the price he had paid, walked straight to the center dais, forcing me to stand right beside him, completely exposed to the scrutiny of everyone. He didn't introduce me first. He began by discussing the failed assassination and the betrayal, making it clear that the attacks were an insult to the entire council's delicate balance of power, a threat to all of them. Then, the true, shocking reason for the summons was revealed. He pulled me closer, his hand leaving my back and settling firmly on my waist, the gesture proprietary and possessive, broadcasting his claim to everyone, and his eyes swept the room, meeting the gaze of every single powerful boss present before he made his shocking declaration, his voice booming with absolute authority and conviction. "This is Lana. She is my woman, she is mine, and she will be respected as such." The simple phrase, "my woman," was a loaded political designation in that world. It wasn't just a term of endearment. It was an official assertion of ownership and authority that instantly demanded respect and required political engagement. "She is not my weakness," he added, his voice hardening, dismissing the prevalent rumor with cold finality. "She is the woman who saved my life when your own trusted lieutenants were planning my demise, and now she is an asset." The silence that followed was heavy, complete, and terrifyingly significant, a silence of utter, stunned disbelief. Viktor Sokolov, seated near the front, couldn't contain his spite or his jealousy at this unprecedented public move. He let out a dry, scornful laugh, loud enough to break the silence and challenge Damien's authority. "Love blinds leaders, Moretti," he scoffed, his voice dripping with condescension and mockery. "You've chosen sentiment over power, a waitress over your legacy. You're finished, and you've just proven it." Damien didn't flinch. He didn't even raise his voice, relying only on the power of his steady gaze. He simply held my gaze for a brief, intense moment, a silent acknowledgement of the reality of our shared peril, then turned his head back to Viktor and delivered his response like a perfectly aimed bullet that silenced the room. "Try touching her. Try to even speak her name without respect. Try to use her to get to me, and you will see how blinded I am, Sokolov." With that challenge hanging in the air, a threat of deeply personal, non-negotiable violence that promised an instant war, Damien did the final, most shocking and intimate act. In front of hundreds of rival bosses, under the relentless glare of their judgment, he leaned down and kissed me. A hard, brief, and utterly demanding kiss that was less about passion and more about marking his territory, making me permanently untouchable and a sacred boundary. When he pulled away, he held my face in his hands, completely ignoring the stunned room, and whispered for my ears alone, a vow that was meant to be the truth we lived by. "I don't let what's mine be mocked, not ever. You are my line in the sand." With that public, irreversible claim, my status changed in an instant. I was no longer a waitress. I was the publicly recognized consort of the Moretti boss, and that recognition, built in front of the highest authority, afforded me a real, if dangerous, status that no one in that room could legally or ethically challenge without declaring open war on Damien. My newfound status as the boss's woman only heightened the danger, turning me into the ultimate, non-negotiable target in the ongoing war with Viktor Sokolov. He couldn't attack Damien's business without starting a global war, and he couldn't kill Damien directly without inviting swift retaliation from the entire council. But he knew exactly where to strike for maximum, devastating damage. The heart of the man who had just declared sentiment over power. Victor played his final, terrifying card by kidnapping me, doing the impossible by infiltrating Moretti's own safe zone. A move so audacious it instantly stripped Damien of his veneer of invulnerability and showed the cracks in his protection. I was in a supposed safe house, reading a book in a quiet moment of false peace, letting myself believe for a moment that the danger had passed, when the reinforced steel door burst open and two masked men grabbed me, moving with a terrifying professional silence that was more chilling than any shouting or struggle. I was blindfolded, gagged, and driven to an unknown location, the entire terrifying ordeal taking less than 5 minutes, leaving me disoriented, panicking, and absolutely certain of my fate. When the blindfold was finally ripped off, I found myself tied with heavy rope to a cold, steel chair in what looked like an abandoned slaughterhouse, a cavernous, concrete room full of hanging hooks and cold, tiled floors that reeked of stale blood and decay. And Viktor Sokolov was standing directly in front of me, a sneer plastered on his face that showed his absolute triumph. He wasn't there to kill me immediately. He was there to broadcast his victory and break Damien's spirit by forcing a terrible choice. He set up a phone on a tripod, ensuring the camera was focused directly on my terrified, tear-streaked face, and initiated a live stream directed straight to Damien's encrypted channels, maximizing the psychological warfare. "Choose, Moretti!" Victor gloated into the phone, his voice a triumphant bark that echoed off the high ceiling. "Your empire, your reputation, your power, the respect of the council, or the cheap waitress you picked up off the street who will die for your sentiment." I could hear the background noise of his men, a chorus of dark, cynical murmurs that drove the point home, and one voice, colder and closer than the others, whispered, his words feeling like a prophecy of doom. "Women linked to Mafia men always die. It's tradition. You should have known better, girl. You should have stayed in the kitchen." I was convinced, absolutely convinced, that this was the end of me, and that Damien would make the rational, kingly choice. Kings always choose the crown over the companion, the stability of the realm over personal affection. I started to cry, the tears tracking slow, hot paths through the dust and fear on my face. But it wasn't fear of death that was overwhelming. It was the crushing, devastating guilt that I had dragged him into this, that I was the obvious, fatal flaw in his perfect armor, and that my quiet existence was now responsible for the potential collapse of his entire empire. Victor, sensing my internal devastation and knowing he had achieved his goal of psychological torment, stepped closer, pulling a long, wicked-looking ceremonial blade from inside his coat, and pressed the cold, sharp edge lightly, almost casually, against my throat, just enough to make me flinch and feel the fragility of my life. "You thought you mattered in this world?" he whispered, his breath stale and hot against my ear, mocking my entire journey. "You were just a pawn for me to take the queen off the board and end Moretti's reign." I closed my eyes, accepting my fate, silently blaming myself for ever walking into that wrong room, for ever thinking I could stand next to a man like him and survive the consequences of his power. The end didn't come with the silent surrender I had prepared for. It came with the deafening sound of an explosion, a sound that tore through the warehouse walls and shattered every window, followed by the blinding flash of an emergency flare, signaling an all-out, non-negotiable assault that sounded like an army had just landed. Damien Moretti didn't wait for his men, and he didn't send a team. He had tracked the signal and stormed Victor's hideout alone, a single-minded force of nature whose focus was entirely on getting to me, and nothing else mattered. He moved through the smoke and the chaos like a vengeful shadow, taking down the 2 guards near the doorway with brutal, efficient force that left them crumpled on the floor with broken limbs. And then he stood in the doorway, staring down Victor, who was still holding the phone and the blade. "I choose her," Damien announced, his voice raw with fury and conviction, his eyes burning with an intensity I had never witnessed, a flame of devotion and rage that could burn the world down. He didn't say, "I choose my empire and her," or "I choose both." He simply stated the ultimate truth. Always her. Now let her go. The fight between the 2 bosses was brutal, a messy, visceral display of violence that had none of the polished choreography of movie scenes. It was a desperate, primal battle fought for absolute control and survival, and they ripped into each other like cornered animals, throwing punches that connected with sickening thuds that rattled the cold floor, sending spray and sweat into the air. Victor, older but perhaps more vicious and armed with the knife, managed to land a devastating, sweeping stab with the blade, sinking it deep into Damien's side, and Damien let out a strangled cry of agony, staggering back, clutching the wound with his hand, the blood instantly saturating his white shirt and darkening the floor beneath his feet. But instead of falling, instead of retreating, he crawled. He crawled on his hands and knees through the debris and the blood splatter, dragging himself toward my chair, using the last of his strength to position his body directly in front of mine, shielding me from Victor, who stood over him, laughing maniacally at the sight of his powerful rival brought low by sentiment. I watched him do it, watched him use his body as a final, bloody barricade, and in that moment, the final vestige of the waitress who was afraid of a single dropped pastry vanished forever. He wasn't obsessed. He was dedicated, sacrificing everything for me. He wasn't just claiming a possession. He was protecting his life, which had somehow become inextricably linked with mine in the crucible of violence. My hands were still shaking, but the silk restraints were loose enough around one wrist that I managed to slip my fingers free, the raw skin burning as I pulled. My eyes scanned the floor, desperate, and I saw a discarded handgun that had fallen from one of the men Damien had downed. I reached out, my fingers trembling as they closed around the cold metal grip, and I didn't hesitate. I lifted the gun, ignoring the fear, ignoring the nausea, aiming it over Damien's shoulder at Victor, who was raising the knife for the final, killing blow. I pulled the trigger, once, with a precision born of pure, desperate survival and a terrifying, protective love that had blossomed in the heart of chaos, a fierce, protective fire that was now my own. The shot cracked, deafening in the small space, and Victor Sokolov dropped, the surprise and the pain etched onto his face as he hit the cold, tiled floor, finally silenced forever. Damien's body slumped against the chair, his strength completely gone, but he was alive, and his first move was to reach up, his bloody hand finding my face, pulling me gently toward him, his thumb brushing away my tears. He whispered the same words he had first used when he recognized me, only this time the meaning was inverted, soaked in the metallic scent of blood and gunpowder, now a statement of life and union. "You didn't enter the wrong room, Lana," he murmured, pulling me tightly into his arms, ignoring his pain, the warm, wet stain of his blood seeping into my dress. "You entered my life, and you saved it, completely." I clung to him, not as a pet, not as a symbol, but as his equal, the girl who was quiet and unassuming, but who carried the moral strength and the fierce will to make the hardest, most necessary choice. I whispered back into his neck, my voice steady, no longer trembling. "Then I'm not leaving." In the final scene, days later, once he was stable and the wreckage was cleared, Damien led me to the head of the Moretti organization's main table, the place that was sometimes called the throne, and he didn't just seat me next to him. He seated me in the chair of honor, placing a kiss on my forehead before the assembled, silent captains, not as his pet, not as his symbol, but as his undeniable, capable, and trusted partner. We stood firm, my quiet strength now his strength, undeniable, unbreakable, and recognized by the entire world they inhabited. "You've been through this. You've been unseen. You've been underestimated by the people who judge worth by the labels you wear or the money in your pocket. But I want you to know this. You were never small. Where are you watching from? Leave a comment below, and hit follow to walk with me through heartbreak, betrayal, and finally healing.